The primaries are not only a way to help lots of people who don't have money to compete early on, but also as kind of a whetstone to sharpen someone into a good candidate. And it does actually do a good job of making somebody into somebody who can compete on a national level. Hi, I'm Walt Hickey. I'm here to talk about the presidential primary and the secret weapon that Trump has to win it. The state delegate allocation system depends on the party. And so the Democrats now are actually a fairly direct system. Each state gets a certain number of delegates. They're allocated entirely proportionally. The Republicans are a little bit more swashbuckling. They have a somewhat more exciting primary structure because they let states do all sorts of different primary types. You can get all the delegates in a winner-take-all state with 35% of the vote if you have enough people splitting the rest of it. You're going to see winner-take-all states, which makes things pretty spicy. And then you're going to see winner-take-most states, which are situations where they have an algorithm basically based on congressional district voting levels and state-level voting. We'll get to it later. But either way, winner-take-most, winner-take-all, proportional. That's going to make this a really interesting GOP primary. The average American voter should care about how these delegates get assigned. I know that this can be a little bit esoteric with specifically the Republican method. We saw in 2016, most people in the GOP didn't vote for Donald Trump in that election. They voted for other candidates. Donald Trump won by finding 40% of the GOP that really liked Donald Trump. Everyone else be damned. And then eventually, once that 40% got him through those winner-take-most and winner-take-all states, he had the party. And so, how a person wins can also speak to how they'll lead. And so it is important to kind of see how these folks end up winning the country. You could definitely call the winner-take-all, winner-take-most the secret weapon for a frontrunner, but it's also not really secret at this point. When people win the Republican nomination, they do so because they overperform in those states. They do so because, they've managed to build a coalition. The reason that different states allocate their delegates in different ways is because there's a couple different phases of a primary. So in the first part of the primary, you've basically got states going one by one. And the idea here is that these are states that are representative of different parts of the country and different constituencies within each party. You've got rural agrarian states like Iowa, you've got the northeastern states that have a unique form of both liberalism and republicanism in New Hampshire, you've got a southern state, and on the Democratic side, a state with a large black population in South Carolina, and then you've got Nevada, which is a mountainous western state that also has, kind of a purplish state in the mix. And so the reason that those states have historically been in the mix is that they're cheap to campaign in. And a theory that all these parties have is that, listen, it shouldn't just be that the richest guy gets to become the president. It should be possible for a good candidate to reveal themselves. And so they have these smaller states one by one because they want to tease out who's actually got that retail campaigning attitude, who can go to diners, kiss babies, go to high school football games, and actually campaign to become the president, regardless of how much money they've managed to raise. And those typically tend to be proportionally allocated because they want to give everybody a little bit of a chance. The biggest night for these winner-take-all states is going to be something that we call Mini Tuesday. It takes place 2 weeks after Super Tuesday, where there's a mix of winner-take-most and winner-take-all. So you've got states like Florida, you've got states like Ohio, you've got states like Illinois, and you've got states like Arizona, and they're just going to give a gusher of delegates to whoever ends up winning those states. That's the moment in the primary where these guys are trying to be okay, time to wrap it up. It's not the biggest night by far, but it is definitely the most decisive because it's going to see, one and maybe two people come away with a real lion's share of those delegates. You're seeing a mix of proportionally allocated states and a mix of winner-take-most states. Those really start to wean out people who aren't going to be the president. If on Super Tuesday you come in 5th in enough states, you don't get to be the president this time, you're probably going to have to drop out. However, it still gives you a fighting chance because that's when you start getting into the later stages of the primary by the end of March. And that is when you really start to get a lot of winner-take-all states coming up to the plate and a lot of winner-take-most states. And you actually kind of stop seeing proportional because we're not messing around anymore. On the GOP side, they want to have a winner, and they want to know that winner. In order to win the nomination, a Republican will need to win 1,215 delegates across these nominating contests in all 50 states, DC, and the territories that get delegates. So that's a pretty tall order. Obviously, it takes a lot of talent, charisma, money, and campaigning ability to get to 40% of the vote. So I don't want to diminish the accomplishment, right? But it is a thing that this party will have to contend with, where they are structurally designed to nominate a niche candidate for a fairly broad party, while the Democratic primary is kind of designed to nominate a like very majority candidate for a party that is really a coalition of oftentimes minority interests within the United States. Inherently, it's going to mean that a GOP nominee is gonna potentially not represent the mainstream view of the Republican Party, that the median Republican voter is, to the right or to the left fairly considerably, whereas you wouldn't expect to see that in the Democrats quite so much.